Dr. Manuela, for that rundown. So earlier this year, the Pacific module did go into the field, like Sam was speaking about, for the second time with our wider HRMI expert survey. So now I'm going to take the opportunity to invite Chad, who along with Susan have been instrumental in developing HRMI's unique survey methodology and sort of the measures that HRMI develops. Chad, I wonder if you're able to just take us through briefly the methodology behind the survey, the work of HRMI more broadly, and how the Pacific module fits into that conversation. And also how this has shaped the way that we collect data for the Pacific module. So over to you, Chad.
Sure, thanks, Patrick. HRMI was founded in 2015 initially with the goal of trying to collect data that would be useful for the global human rights movement for practitioners all over the world. And so with that goal in mind, all of our data, all of our approaches and all the like have been co-designed with human rights practitioners from all around the world. And thus far for, pretty much every country that we bring in the data set, we're trying to collect data on 5 economic and social rights. These data are built upon, I should say, data that are already existing in international databases. So we're able to create scores for 194 countries in 2021 on this, most countries in the world. These scores take each country's income into account and tries to see essentially who's doing the best they can with what they have in terms of economic resources and producing good outcomes for people who live in countries via the sort of progressive realization process. However, international databases can't tell us everything we need to know about all human rights, not even economic and social rights. And so as Patrick was saying earlier, we also use a survey methodology to collect some information on these 5 economic and social rights, as well as to collect information on 8 different civil and political rights. For this methodology, right, we can't go to some international database to find the number of people who were targeted for torture and ill treatment by the government, or the number of people who didn't fully enjoy their right to participate politically and the like. So for this, when we co-designed these metrics, human rights practitioners essentially told us that the best source of information for finding out what's happening around the world is essentially to go to them and ask them what's happening in their countries. And so we use a secure, anonymous online survey of in-country human rights experts to essentially find out what's happening in each country around the world on these 8 civil and political rights. Thus far, we've run the survey in 39, we've received data that we can put online for 39 countries that are now available online on the Rights Tracker in 2021, and we try to add more countries every single year. So it's within that framework that we introduced the Pacific module for the reasons Roy talked about earlier. That annual practitioner survey is really built around asking people directly about what's happening in their country. And, participants in that Pacific co-design workshop in 2019 largely told us that while, yes, it was exciting to have the information we're collecting in other parts of the survey for the Pacific, we were missing out on really big chunks of interesting things that are more important to the Pacific. And so the Pacific module, was designed around asking about subjects that were prioritized by those co-design workshop participants, as well as participants in Layer Talanoa, as well as in, among other Pacific partners that have come and worked with us in testing sessions and other kinds of co-design with us. And so the methodology there still really falls in line with the same survey we had long run for those other data. But now, in the Pacific module focuses on providing context for climate crisis, indigenous sovereignty, indigenous land rights, and cultural rights via both sort of summary statistics, right? In the way that Sam was describing a second ago of giving us a quick number that sort of summarizes what people told us, but then also providing qualitative detail that comes from responses we get to those open-ended questions where people can tell us far more context about what's going on with each of these issues. We get that same qualitative detail for the community violence questions as well, but those tend to resemble the methodology we use for civil and political rights, where we're not only sort of summarizing the responses people give us, but we're trying to produce data that are comparable, in this case, across the Pacific and between countries in the Pacific, where people essentially are able to tell us how they interpret the scale and we use that interpretation to place everyone on the same scale to produce metrics that both allow us to make comparisons as well as say something about uncertainty, because as has been mentioned before, a survey is an imperfect methodology for actually getting to these concerns and understanding them. And so we're trying to be as honest as possible and as transparent as possible about the uncertainty that's kind of inherent in that design. Patrick, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, a huge mahalo whakatai to you, Chad. It's always exciting for me anyway, to hear you speak about the uniqueness and robustness of HRMI's methodology, and specifically around the Pacific module itself, which segues nicely, I think, into the next session. And I guess this is the fun bit. This is where I'm going to ask Sam to come back and present to you all a quick overview of some of the findings of the 2021 HRMI Pacific module data, with an eye to the launch of the rights tracker a little later on. In this session, I believe Sam will also talk about some of the the existing data that we also already have from last year's module. So thank you once again, Sam.
Thank you, Patrick. So this year, within the Pacific module, we had responses from 19 countries, so experts across 19 countries in the Pacific, and this includes around 187 people as well. And so the list of countries are there listed on the right-hand side there. And so as we talked about earlier, these responses include optional open-ended responses, in addition to the statistics that we have across each of our core themes. And so the core themes, Alyssa, if you could go to the next slide, please. So some of the key findings, there was a lot of data to go through, especially with the qualitative responses. What we have done is for each country, we have gone through the responses and thematically organized them into different areas underneath each of the themes that we were going across. The key findings that I'm presenting here is a summary of summaries across everything. So, you know, when we're doing those kinds of summaries there, we do lose a little bit of that detail, but these are some of the key things that are being picked up across the entire Pacific region that we notice within the data. And primarily here, I'm talking about the qualitative responses in the data sets. So in relation to the climate crisis, so we asked participants to what extent that they feel that the climate crisis is worsening human rights across the Pacific. And within the open-ended responses there, a lot of experts noted that the climate crisis is impacting on food security, access to water, shelter. And a lot of this has to do with the physical impacts or the environmental impacts of rising waters, increasing salination in soils, and also people being displaced from their homes as well and having to move inland. Violence was another aspect that came up as well, where the growing tensions caused by climate crisis were creating social tensions within families, but also within Pacific nations as well. So there could be tensions growing between people who have been forced to move inland into the lands of other peoples there as well. One thing that we did notice in the thematic analyses that we conducted here is that all of these rights are interconnected. They weren't viewed in isolation from each other. They had ranging impacts and influences on each other. So there is a lot of going backwards and forth. And this is just to really recognize that the impacts of human rights are felt holistically as well, rather than these kind of delineated areas in which we're talking about. In relation to rights to Indigenous sovereignty, again, this was varied across the Pacific. The statistical summaries show that there are differences across the Pacific, but the common themes that we saw within the qualitative responses was the ongoing impacts of colonization. And the way that this is felt across Pacific nations varied as well. Some have varying degrees of independence, and some are still in a very strong relationships with their colonial countries. For countries that where experts felt that there is strong independence with their country, within their countries, there were concerns around the growing dependency on foreign aid and the implications that this has on their rights to Indigenous sovereignty as well. In relation to Indigenous land rights, again, the impacts of colonization came into play here. More specifically, what many experts were noting was that there are traditional land systems, but can often be in conflict with the introduced land tenure systems brought in by colonial governments. And a lot of experts spoke around the difficulties there were for Indigenous communities to be able to navigate these complex land tenure systems that were being introduced. Some countries noted land grabbing by the governments and also the gendered patterns around land rights as well. So many countries have their own gendered norms and how this impacts on the rights to particular lands as well. And many experts noted that quite often women were on the disadvantaged end of around this as well. In terms of cultural rights, many countries did rate this quite highly. Language was a key aspect that was brought up as well. And so across the Pacific, many communities are able to speak the languages and practice the customs and values that they all adhere to. But there were concerns around the dominance of English and the increasing dominance of English that are impacting on some Indigenous languages as well. So for many schools, English language is the primary language of instruction in which children are being educated in. And so again, we were noting here that the kind of interrelationships across all of these themes, particularly the impacts of colonization that has on human rights, but also the impacts of the climate crisis having on human rights as well. Alyssa, could we go to the next slide, please? And so when looking at violence towards vulnerable communities, what I've got here is snapshots from the rights tracker, which we will be looking at very, very soon. But I'm just going to talk very briefly here about the overall patterns that we can see. And we will go into a little bit more detail about the actual scores and the uncertainty bands that we see in here. But overall, what we're seeing is that across each community here, there is general similarities across our Pacific regions. So because of the methodology that we have used here, we're able to make these comparisons a little bit more meaningfully. And so this top left one here is children's right to freedom from violence. And as we can see here, a lot of the Pacific nations within the Pacific are scoring on a relatively similar pattern there. On the top right corner is violence towards MVP, FAF, and LGBTQI+ peoples and their rights to freedom from violence. And again, we're seeing some similarity, although it looks like that there is the kind of ratings that the right scores more towards the right-hand side indicate more people are more safe, and scores towards the left-hand side indicate that people are less safe. And we can see here at the top is Niue. And because of the uncertainty bands here, it looks like that we could make a meaningful argument that rainbow communities are more safe from violence compared to other countries such as within Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. And this is because of the certainty that we have around there. And that certainty comes around the number of participants that we have making responses to. And there could be other things that play here as well. The bottom left is women's and girls' rights to freedom from violence. And the bottom right is people with disabilities' right to freedom from violence as well. And so the way that these are currently ranked is from the highest, so more safe, to the to lowest, which is the less safe there. And what I can see just from eyeballing the data is that overall that the scores are roughly similar across the Pacific region, and that's only because of the uncertainty that we have around the actual scores that we have got here. And so I would be cautious around making claims of differences across the Pacific region, but we are seeing some general patterns here. And interestingly, it does look like if we're comparing, for example, women and girls' rights to freedom from violence to, say, for example, rainbow communities' rights to freedom from violence, that there might be some kind of differences where perhaps women and girls might be experiencing less safety within the Pacific nations. Again, we've been cautious around the comparisons that we're trying to make here, but the main thing is that we have now data to reflect that, or reflect what is happening within our Pacific nations. On the rights tracker, you will see that there is also data available from countries that we have responded to in 2019 as well. I don't have that data presented today, but if we go to the next slide, please, Alyssa. And so, looking back to our 2020 reports, so this was the data that was based on the pilot survey that we conducted. And this report is available via our website, and it does document a lot of the things that we have covered here today. But what we're starting to see now, or what we're hoping to achieve, is that if we can make measurements or take surveys every year, we can start to look at progress and change over time, especially if we are very confident and secure in the measures that we are using. And so one thing that we're going to be doing is constantly looking at ensuring that what the measures are accurate and reliable, which they are, and that we are able to make these measurements every single year so we can see how change happens over time. At the moment, we have got 2 time points. So we can go back and forth between the 2019 data and the 2020 data, which we will see a little bit later on in the second session. But making conclusions that, say, for example, we have seen an increase in safety from violence, based on 2 time points is a little bit hard to make. So that the more time points that we have, the more confident that we can be in the progress that is happening in human rights across the Pacific. But for now, what we do have is information from 2020 and information from 2021 as well. And we are hoping to continue on with this work so we can look at how it will be changing, both in relation to the 4 themes that we had earlier with the climate crisis, Indigenous land rights, Indigenous sovereignty and cultural rights, but also that we're seeing what is happening in relation to violence towards vulnerable communities within the Pacific as well. Cool, thank you, Patrick.
All right, thank you, Sam. So we're going to move into the next section, and we are running a little bit behind schedule. So I'm going to pass this over to Thalia now to talk to you about the way in which HRMI was able to kind of take into account the COVID context. So in the latest iteration of the survey, the HRMI team developed a special module that included questions around how COVID has impacted human rights in our region. And so I'll invite Thalia now to present some of that data for you very quickly. Over to you, Thalia.
Kia ora anō. Yes, so this year, as well as our usual global questions on 13 human rights that Chad has already talked about, and the Pacific module questions that Sam was talking about, this year we also asked questions about COVID-19 because we wanted to know how the government's actions, the government's responses to the pandemic had affected human rights. So first we asked about our 13 human rights in 3 groups. And then for each group, we asked what effect COVID-19 had had on human rights in each country in 2020. On our website, humanrightsmeasurement.org, you can download all of the data and a report. And we'll be sending out links to those in an email after the presentation as well. So I'm going to go very quickly through some things, but you'll be able to look up the data for your country shortly. So here's what people in Pacific countries told us. For safety from the state rights, things like freedom from torture, arbitrary arrest and detention, and so on, there was quite a range of responses, from the pandemic having pretty much no effect on these rights in places like the Marshall Islands to worse in Tonga. Now, I know the text is pretty small, but we will be sending out the links after the presentation, so you can see everything in detail. On the next slide, you'll see that empowerment rights were more badly affected across the whole region. And then on the next slide, you see the biggest effect is on economic and social rights. So more about those in a moment. In the appendix of our report, also available on our website, you can see scores country by country. So for example, here's what we have for Fiji. In the survey, we then asked which of those rights in those groups were particularly affected. And these next graphs say how many of our respondents chose each right to say that it was affected by COVID-19. So we see for Fiji, COVID had no effect on extrajudicial killing or the right to freedom from death penalty execution, but many people said that it made arbitrary arrest and detention worse. On the next slide, we see that empowerment rights were affected much more strongly. More people said that they were affected. So obviously lockdowns and border closures affected people's rights to assembly. That's the middle column, where almost everybody said that that was a problem. But our respondents also said that the rights to opinion and expression and political participation were affected. And on this last slide, we see that nearly everyone said that each economic and social right was affected: the rights to food, education, health, housing, and work. People gave lots of specific examples of how these rights were violated during the pandemic, and you can read their specific comments on the rights tracker, as Sam and Anne-Marie will demonstrate later on this morning, and also in the PDF report that you can access on our website, and Anne-Marie's just popped the link in the chat box. We hope that as the pandemic continues, that governments can learn from their mistakes and their successes, and they can preserve people's rights and well-being as much as possible while they respond to COVID-19. Thank you, Patrick, back to you.